Hello everybody, and thank you for waiting. We would like to apologise for the slight delay in starting this webinar session with you today. We were just having some minor technical difficulties. I will start now without further ado. Firstly, welcome to all of you. We are delighted that you can take part in this webinar about the pharmaceutical industry that Sustainalytics have organised today. My name is Niamh O'Sullivan and I am an Associate Analyst with Sustainalytics Thematic Research Team based here in Amsterdam. I have the pleasure of being your moderator for today's webinar session on the pharmaceutical industry. This session will focus on the discussion of our recently launched Pharmaceuticals report, and we were very happy about this recent launch of the report because we feel that it is a very timely report, feeding into many of the most pertinent recent and ongoing discussions and debates about business ethics, product quality and safety, and also access to medicine within the pharmaceutical industry today. So we're delighted, as I say, that so many of you can join the call. I would like to extend a special note of thanks to those of you that are joining us for the first time. If you are unfamiliar with Sustainalytics and who we are and what we do, we are an international research-based firm providing specialized research and analysis on environmental, social and governance issues, otherwise known as ESG issues, for international institutional investors, so that they can use this information in their investment decision-making and ownership activities. One of the many things we do in Sustainalytics is the periodic production of sector reports on important industries within our very broad research universe, such as the pharmaceutical industry and the sector report for that industry that we are actually presenting today. These particular reports highlight key ESG issues that we feel are most material to the industry. They engage in the rating of company performance against these ESG issues. We showcase best practice in the reports, highlighting leaders and laggards with regard to these issues in the sector reports. And in general, we provide comprehensive insights into ESG issues and trends and performances within particular industries that are most beneficial and helpful for investors in their decision-making processes. Today, I am gathered by my colleague Hazel Goedhart, who is our sector manager for the healthcare and chemicals team in Sustainalytics. Hazel is our resident expert on the pharmaceutical industry, and she co-authored our pharmaceutical report with the thematic research team here in Sustainalytics. Hazel will provide you with an overview of the structure, the content and the key findings of the report, which will take about 35 to 45 minutes of presentation. Following the presentation, we will have a questions and answers session with you, and that will take about 15 minutes or so. Before we get into that, I'd like to just highlight some housekeeping issues for you. As you can see here on the slide, what we would like you to do when it comes to the actual submission of your questions, we would like you to submit your questions via the question box you can see highlighted with the number 1 here on your screen. The reason to do this is because we have muted all of you currently on the call to try to minimize any background noise disturbance or interference, and we would therefore like you to submit your questions via the chat box in order to do so, as you will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar. Incidentally, you can also submit any queries or questions you have with regard to the sound quality or any other issues with regard to the webinar today through this question box to us, and we will try to address any of those issues as soon as possible. Secondly, if you would like to minimize this side panel so that you can see the presentation more clearly on your screen, you can quite simply click on the top orange arrows at the top of the side panel indicated here with number 2, and that will minimize the side panel for you so that you can follow the presentation clearly on your screen. So without further ado, I would now like to pass over to my colleague Hazel, who will present the sector report on the pharmaceutical industry to you. Thank you, Hazel.
Thank you very much, Neve, and it's a pleasure to see so many of you listening in to this webinar. Thank you all for attending. My name is Hazel. I'm the sector manager at Sustainalytics for the healthcare and chemicals industry team. So I lead a team of analysts that do research on the ESG performance of healthcare and chemicals companies. I've been with Sustainalytics for 3.5 years now, and during that time I've been building expertise on the pharmaceutical industry and its ESG issues. Last year I've been closely involved in the research and analysis that we provided for the Access to Medicine Index, which was published in November. And more recently I've been spending a lot of time writing this sector report, which I'm now presenting to you. The sector report itself is, I think, about 100 pages long, so I can only present a few % of it here. I hope it will entice you to start reading it, or at least read parts of it, because it's been designed in such a way that you can also read the chapters separately. So what will I be discussing today? Well, I will present to you the background of the sector report, so how do we approach the report. I will present an overview of the key industry trends that we identified for the pharmaceutical industry. I will provide you with an overview of the key ESG issues we identified, and in the interest of time I will only go into detail about 2 of those issues. We will take a brief look at company performance, so a few highlights there on leaders and laggards and differences in geographies and sub-industries. And finally, we'll see how everything ties together and how the industry trends and key ESG issues relate to each other. So let's move to the background of the sector report. So this is how we approached the sector report. We looked at 2 dimensions of ESG impact, sustainability impact and business impact. So sustainability impact is the impact that companies have or could have on society and the environment, and this in turn exposes the company to certain business risks. So there's the potential negative impact on the company's business. So all of this is depicted on the right-hand side of this slide. And finally, we also look at another type of business impact, namely that which is caused by ESG macro trends. So that could, for example, be population growth, economic crises, etc. So these are factors that are, of course, largely outside of the sphere of control of individual companies, but nevertheless they need to respond to them. So basically we look at the impact of a company's operations as well as the impact on a company's operations. And these impacts could take place at any point in the company's value chain. You see the pharmaceutical value chain depicted here, which goes from research and development to manufacturing to distribution, marketing, product use, and finally disposal. So this matrix, which we call the materiality matrix, it depicts in one view the 7 key ESG issues that we identified for the pharma industry, and also it plots the severity of their sustainability and business impact along 2 axes. And we've identified these key ESG issues through a value chain analysis, so as depicted in the previous slide. And for each part of the value chain, we assessed where the main ESG risks lie. And this is basically the end result of that analysis and also the starting point for how we assess the ESG performance of pharma companies. It's also included in all the company profiles that you can download from our client platform. Now, in the sector report, we also provide detailed aggregated data of company ESG performance, so examples of leaders and laggards, best practices, etc. And later in this presentation, I will provide a brief snapshot of this. But here I just want to give some background on how we approach the assessment of companies' ESG performance. Basically, we look at 4 pillars. Preparedness, which is management systems and policies. So for pharma companies, for example, a program on ethical marketing, a program on hazardous waste generation. We also look at disclosure, which is basically the scope of company disclosure in terms of their ESG reporting. We look at quantitative performance, anything measurable such as water intensity, And finally, qualitative performance, which is basically the controversies that companies may be involved in. And for pharmaceuticals, the most salient controversies are typically seen in the area of customers and society and community. Let's move to the key industry trends. So in the sector report, we talk about two macro trends that influence the pharma industry. One is declining innovation, and the other is increasing pricing pressures. So let's look at each of them in turn. So if we talk about innovation, I'm referring to the successful development of new medical treatments, and of course ideally treatments that address real unmet medical needs. We've seen over the years that drug innovation has been declining. This graph clearly depicts that. It's compiled with data from the US FDA on the number of approvals they give each year for what they call new molecular entities, and it shows a clear declining trend over the past 15 years or so. But if you would also factor in the costs of developing one new drug, which have been steadily increasing over the same period, the picture would actually look even worse, because the output of each $1 billion spent on R&D has declined quite dramatically over the past few years. Now, of course, a decline in innovation does not immediately affect companies, since they can still profit from innovations that they made years or even decades ago. However, this does end at some point, and namely when a certain drug that has been generating huge revenue streams for a company goes off patent. Of course, at that point, generic competitors come in and the prices are driven down significantly. To give an example, in 2012, which you can see in this graph, it was a year of a very large amount of revenue loss due to patent expirations. The sales growth for the sector was minimal in that year, and the revenues of the worst affected companies, which were AstraZeneca and Bristol-Myers Squibb, fell by up to 17% due to patent expirations on blockbuster drugs. So there's a clear need for companies to respond to that and to come up with innovative new products. So how have we seen companies respond? Well, we've seen positive and negative responses. On the positive side, we are seeing in recent years more of a focus in companies' R&D efforts. So it could be a focus on specific disease areas or specific patient groups. We've also seen more R&D collaboration, so public-private partnerships, private-private partnerships, and sometimes, in fact, this is the only way to address R&D challenges, particularly in an area where commercial incentives for companies are low. It does become worthwhile once companies can spread the risks between the partners and share in the rewards. Unfortunately, we've also seen quite some negative responses. We've seen a concept called evergreening emerge. Evergreening basically refers to reapplying for a patent on an existing product based on minor modifications that cannot truly be considered innovative. It's a way of kind of artificially extending the patent life of a product. We've also seen that companies have been trying to milk their existing product portfolio to the maximum by various marketing tactics, sometimes quite aggressive marketing tactics designed to up sales. And sometimes this can even take quite unethical or illegal forms when companies, for instance, market products to children that have only been approved for adults, or when they provide misleading information about the safety or efficacy of their products, and this, of course, can cause severe harm to patients. Our sector report actually includes an entire separate chapter on this. It's called the Spotlight chapter, which really zooms in on marketing practices. And finally, we've seen a lot of political lobbying from the industry. For instance, in the US in 2013, federal lobbying spending by pharmaceutical companies was the highest out of all of the industries. And this can have negative effects. For instance, in the US, industry lobby has resulted in Medicare and Medicaid not being allowed to negotiate on prices with pharma companies. like to zoom in on the second trend that we identified, pricing pressures. So what we see is that the industry is facing significant and increasing pressure from governments and society to lower drug prices and or to justify their prices. So I think in emerging markets this has been going on for already a few decades, I would say. I think the public debate on drug prices really kicked off in the 1990s with the AIDS pandemic and continues to this day in emerging markets, where we see tactics that vary from adapting patenting laws to restrict drug patenting, as India has done, and South Africa is also considering compulsory licensing, which is basically overruling a patent in the interest of public health. Or it can take the form of restricting marketing access for drugs that are considered too expensive, or just direct bargaining from EM governments to pressure pharma companies to lower their prices. Now, bargaining power of emerging markets governments is considerable, especially since most of the growth for the industry in the coming years is expected in these regions. So companies have great incentives to want to enter these markets. What we see here is a graph that depicts the prices of 10 on-patent products and comparing how they're priced in 3 emerging markets, Turkey, Russia, and Brazil. And one of the things that's interesting here is that you see that the prices are by far the lowest in Turkey. Now Turkey has a universal healthcare system, so the bill in the end is always paid by the government, so the government has a clear incentive to drive down prices, and they've done so quite successfully, and you can see the differences are quite large. So companies have responded to these pressures in various ways, some by lowering their prices or by developing and delivering products that are needed in developing countries, becoming more flexible with their intellectual property. And these are, by the way, also some of the things that were measured in the Access to Medicine Index. And I will give some examples of best practice in these areas when we discuss access to health in more detail later on in this presentation. But more recently, we've seen that pricing pressures in developed markets have also intensified significantly. And this is driven partly by the rising costs of healthcare overall, which is threatening to become unsustainable in many countries. This graph depicts healthcare spending, and that in OECD countries, and I know it's a very ugly graph as a researcher who tried to cram too much information in one graph, but what it clearly shows is that there's a rising trend in all these countries. And the US is a clear outlier there. It's the red line on the top, because it's the only, part of the reason is it's the only developed market where companies can basically set whatever price they want for their medicines. So rising healthcare costs is one of the factors that are leading to pricing pressures, but there are other factors as well. There are, of course, the general austerity measures that governments have been implementing since the most recent economic crisis. There have also been a number of drug safety scandals in the past few years, and concerns over the efficacy of certain drugs, and these have made governments more wary of paying high prices for products if they don't know whether they're going to be safe or effective. And of course there's generic competition that is driving down prices. So all of these pressures have led to the emergence of a relatively new concept called value-based pricing. It's partly the result of the fact that payers, and by payers I mean whatever institution pays for medicines, which really varies a lot from country to country, but these payers exercise increasing control over what doctors can or cannot prescribe, and increasingly pricing factors into those decisions. So payers are willing to pay for drugs, but only to the extent that they feel it has real added value for society. They want to pay what it's worth. Generally, this value is determined by two factors, so cost effectiveness and comparative effectiveness, so how effective is a product compared to similar products. Measuring these things requires very sophisticated data gathering on a drug's long-term effects on large patient groups. So it's not so easily done. I think two markets that are relatively well progressed in implementing value-based pricing are Germany and the UK. Here's just one example, and I don't want to highlight Sanofi negatively, it's just one of many examples. But Sanofi launched a new cancer drug recently, and physicians in the US felt that it had no significant added value over existing treatments for the same type of cancer, yet it was significantly more expensive than those existing treatments, and Sanofi was ultimately forced to reduce the price by 50%. But by then it was too late, since doctors were not really seriously considering the product anymore. So it's an example of how being reactive rather than proactive on pricing can hurt the bottom line. So having covered the main industry trends, I would like to move to the key ESG issues, and as we will see, they are clearly linked to the industry trends. So I'm going to zoom in on two key ESG issues. In total, we've identified 7 for the pharma industry. 3 have dedicated chapters in the sector report, and here I'm only talking about 2 of them in the interest of time, and also because these are the 2 that are the most obviously linked to the industry trends that I just talked about. So I'll be talking about access to healthcare and also about product quality and safety. So access to healthcare, if you look at how what the sustainability impact of the issue is, of course there's a considerable impact on the individuals who actually lack access to life-saving or life-enhancing drugs, and we're still talking about probably over 1 billion people globally. But we're also talking about the societal burden of poor health, since a healthy society is a productive society. So I talked previously about the 2 impact dimensions, sustainability impact and business impact. So what is the business impact of access to healthcare? Basically, there's a risks side and an opportunity side. So there's a regulatory risk if companies don't proactively promote access to their products. They do run the risk of, for example, facing compulsory licensing measures from governments. India has shown in the past few years that it's not afraid of doing that. And it can be avoided by taking a more proactive stance and entering in discussions with the government in question before entering the market and discussing price. Through that, you can avoid these risks. But there's also a clear opportunity side here, and I think this should be compelling to all pharma companies because their future growth depends on successfully entering emerging markets. And one way of securing success in emerging markets and getting your foot in the door, so to speak, is to have access to medicine initiatives in place that ensure access for poorer population groups, and through that you can build trust in your brand and your company and build good relations locally. So I think there's a strong business case actually for companies to address access to healthcare. So how have companies performed so far? Well, looking at our global pharma universe of 132 companies, which includes developed and emerging markets, we see performance is fragmented. A lot of companies are not doing anything. If you look at the indicator on the left, which just measures whether companies have any kind of access to medicine programs or initiatives, we see that 2/3 of them do not. And if you look at one of the sub-issues of equitable pricing, so this measures whether companies have adopted flexible pricing based on affordability, the picture is even less positive, with 2/3 of companies not having adopted any such programs. And even for the companies that have adopted access to medicine programs, we see, these are very often ad hoc and not really incorporated into their core business models. One positive example, there are a number of them, but I will highlight GlaxoSmithKline. For the 4th time in a row, they achieved the top rank in the Access to Medicine Index, and one of the reasons is that they apply flexible pricing based on affordability. So in the least developed countries, the company offers all its patented products at 25% or less of its price in the UK. And they were one of the first really to adopt this approach, and the company's CEO has credited this low margins, high volume approach as one of the reasons for its success in emerging markets. So I tried to also put together some tips for investors if they want to engage with companies on access to health. I won't go into each of these questions in detail, but you're free to look at them and use them. I think in the end it's really about whether companies have incorporated access to medicine or access to health in their core business strategies. I would say that's the main thing. I'd like to move to the second key ESG issue, which is product quality and safety. This is the issue, if you remember the materiality matrix that I showed at the beginning, that actually has the highest business impact of all the issues. But to start with the sustainability impact of the issue, the main impact area, as you can see in this chart, is customers who can be harmed by unsafe or ineffective products. The business impact then, it's multifaceted. We see there's a clear regulatory risk, and this regulatory risk, you can identify it in each stage of the pharmaceutical value chain. So from R&D to product marketing and everything in between, authorities are prone to implementing stricter approval procedures for launching new drugs in the market, higher fines for improper marketing, and these are clear trends that we've seen in the past years and that will likely continue in the future. There's also litigation risks, mainly from customers who file product liability suits against companies, which can cost billions of dollars in settlements. And there's reputational risk for companies. So, in the end, if consumers lose trust in the company, it will affect the bottom line. In order to give you some idea of how companies perform in product quality and safety, I thought in this case it would be most useful to look at the controversies we've seen in the past few years on this issue. Out of our total universe of 132 pharma companies, product quality and safety is actually the area where we see the highest number of controversies for the industry. Here you see 3 controversy indicators that are directly or indirectly related to product quality and safety. Sustainalytics assesses controversies on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being reserved for the worst of the worst. Currently we have 8 companies assessed at a category 4 for product quality safety, and 1 category 5 under marketing practices, which is GlaxoSmithKline for its bribery scandal in China. One example of a category 4 under the quality and safety indicator is Bayer. It has faced numerous customer claims regarding the safety of its contraceptive pills, which has led to over 10,000 lawsuits, having cost the company $1.4 billion by 2013. So again, I tried to put together some tips for investors if they want to engage with companies on this issue. I would suggest taking a product lifecycle approach and discuss with the company the risks at each stage of the value chain. So for R&D, have they conducted risk-benefit analysis before launching or developing new products? Are they transparent about their clinical trial data? In manufacturing, do they adhere to best practice standards and engage in auditing? For distribution, is the integrity of distribution chains guaranteed? And for marketing, do they have ethical standards in place for interactions with doctors, training for sales staff, and incentive for sales staff to do the right thing? So the final part of my presentation is some highlights on ESG performance. So we're talking now about the overall ESG performance of pharma companies, so not just on the issues that we just discussed, but on all the indicators that we use to assess pharma companies' performance. This graph shows the distribution of ESG scores for developed markets. Companies divided among the environmental, social, and governance scores. If you look at the social scores, which is the gray bars, it's clear that there's a skew to the left, so there's significantly more leaders than laggards, and this is actually much less pronounced for environment and governance. And this is of concern since we consider the social theme to be the most important for the pharma industry, and it's actually weighed heavier than the other two in the overall score calculation. So it means a lot of companies are still lagging behind in that area. This is a snapshot of the leaders in the upper and lower market cap brackets. So just as a reminder, or for those of you who are not familiar with our research framework, we score companies between 0 and 100. And just as a reminder, a high score doesn't necessarily mean that the company is not involved in any controversies or that it performs well across the board, but it's an average of its performance. So I don't have the time really to go into each of these companies and why they're considered leaders, but just some general remarks. We see that European companies tend to outperform North American and Asian, as in most other industries. Also, as in most other industries, there's a clear large cap bias. So you see the upper market cap bracket here performs much better than the lower market cap. And all the leaders are large, global, vertically integrated pharmaceutical companies. So, for example, the biotech sub-industry performs much more poorly, likely also because it's a relatively young industry. So, leading now to my conclusions. This graph, you've seen it in the beginning, but now it's customized to address the industry trends that we've talked about and the key ESG issues that we've talked about. So we see that companies across their value chain are exposed to certain sustainability impacts in the area of access to healthcare and product quality and safety. The main sustainability impacts are on customers who are affected by the affordability and quality of products. This in turn exposes companies to business risks, mainly related to expectations, enhanced expectations from customers and from regulators. And companies are also exposed to the broader ESG macro trends in the areas of innovation and pricing, which also lead to pressure on the industry from governments and society to address these issues more proactively. So my conclusion, well, we've looked at identified two main industry trends: declining innovation and increasing pricing pressures. We've seen that these trends create strong business imperatives for companies to address access to health and product quality and safety. And however, we've also seen the industry so far lags behind, particularly on social performance. My outlook is that the industry will have no choice but to adapt to all of these trends and pressures, but that it will require fundamental changes in business models, and which will be a slow and painful process. This brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'm open to any questions that you may have. If we don't get to answer your question during this session, you can also see my contact details on this slide, and feel free to send me an email or phone me at any point if you want to discuss any of these issues further.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Hazel, for very interesting oversight into the pharmaceutical industry. Just as we're reviewing some of the questions that we've received, I'd like to kickstart the questions and answers session with you. My question would be, if I was an investor looking at the report and I see a number of different scores for one particular company related to the ESG issues, how do I interpret them? Meaning, if I see that one particular company score is very high when it comes to access to medicine, but a score is very low with regard to product quality and safety and also business ethics, should that raise alarm bells for me? How should I interpret the numbers? Should I take maybe a more measured approach to their interpretation if I'm trying to understand the performance of this company for my ESG analysis of them?
Yeah. Thanks, Neve, for that question. So first of all, I think it is important to look at the performance of companies on the different issues and not just their overall ESG performance. So the overall ESG score, it gives you a rough picture of whether a company is a leader or a laggard, but it can still mean that they underperform in a certain area, for example. And I do think it's important to then address that with the company. And I also think as an investor, it's important, if you want to start engaging with pharma companies, to have a clear idea of which issues you find important. I've highlighted what we find important, but you may, based on your own investment strategy, say, for example, that you want to focus on product quality and safety because the business impact of that particular issue is higher than for the other key ESG issues, for example. Or if you are interested in emerging markets, or how companies perform in emerging markets, you may want to look at access to medicine because it's an important factor in successfully entering emerging markets. So, that would be my advice.
Okay, very good. So investors should look at this as being case dependent, specific to what their actual wants and desires and interests are, and to use it as guidelines with regard to that. Okay, great. Thank you, Hazel. We have a question about business ethics. I know that this is one of the other ESG issues in the report. You didn't touch upon it in any great detail in the presentation today, which leads us to one of the questions sent in by Donna Mayer, and she states that on one of the first slides you show that business ethics has a low impact. It would seem that ethics would be ranked as a higher impact.
Yeah. So I should first of all explain what we mean by business impact, business ethics, because it's a very generic term. But for the pharma industry, we actually only mean R&D ethics. So ethics in clinical trials, animal testing, genetic engineering, stem cell research, other emerging technologies. These kind of things. If you're thinking about corruption, actually corruption falls under marketing practices, which we have put under product quality and safety, because in the end, that's the effect is on effects of corruption are on customers who don't get sufficient information about safe product use. So that's the ultimate impact of corruption is on product quality and safety. That's just to clarify how we group those issues. So if we look at business impact, understanding that we're only talking about R&D ethics, I think the sustainability impact is definitely high, since we're talking about, for example, if we talk about ethics in clinical trials, in the end it's about impact on the lives and well-being of the clinical trial participants. But the business impact assessed as being relatively low because we've not seen a lot of repercussions for companies in terms of ethical conduct in clinical trials. So there haven't been high fines, for example, or in a lot of countries regulations are kind of loose or lacking. So currently the business impact would seem to be low.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Hazel. Continuing with the issue of business ethics for a moment, we have received another question about the specific topic of animal welfare, which is obviously a key indicator for us when it comes to business ethics. The question relates to company scores. Which companies have scored best with regard to animal welfare? Can you think of any off the top of your head at the moment? Or?
Wow, it's a tough question from the top of my head. I know that a lot of large pharma companies actually have quite strong programs in terms of animal welfare, particularly when it comes to animal testing. There's a lot of industry initiatives also out there in terms of, reducing, refining, and replacing animal testing. And so performance in this area, at least for developed markets, is generally quite all right. Of course, one of the main risks is still that companies can outsource their animal testing, for example, to China, where the regulation is much laxer. And of course, we would then expect companies to that the same standards apply for their outsourced animal testing. Same goes for clinical trials in humans, actually. There's a lot of outsourcing, and we expect companies to uphold the same standards for outsourced trials and also monitor and audit whether that's actually the case.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Hazel. There's a lot of interest in the broad business ethics topic here today from our participants. One more relates to the process of, as they refer to it, unethical or illegal marketing. The question relates to how can companies try to address these activities? How do you think it's realistic for them to begin to address these activities, considering the sort of negative scores that they're receiving and the ongoing bribery and corruption scandals that we're facing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, in general we see just lower and lower levels of tolerance for this kind of behavior from the general public, from governments, from regulators. We've seen multi-billion-dollar fines incurred by several major pharma companies, so GSK, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, for improper marketing activities in developed markets. So it's a problem in both developed and emerging markets. But as I said, tolerance is decreasing. For example, what you see clearly is that doctors in developed markets, at least, are restricting access for doctors. So in the past, sales reps could just walk into the doctor's office. That's no longer the case in many offices. They don't have free access. So the doctors are saying, well, we don't want this influence from companies if they're only going to give us biased information. We want objective, scientifically valid, trustworthy information on products. And so they're becoming increasingly wary. And I think, that this is something that is out of the control of companies, and they will have to respond to it. And they will have to, in the end, it's about, if you're selling products that have real socioeconomic added value, in a way, the products should sell themselves. And if you have the scientific information to back it up, you don't need to use improper marketing practices, such as, basically misrepresenting the efficacy of your product or providing improper incentives for doctors to prescribe products. That shouldn't be necessary. And I think it will become harder and harder for companies to apply these kind of improper marketing practices. We've now seen in China that the government is starting to come down really hard on companies for corruption. So companies will have to respond. And one of the things they can do is to look into their interactions with doctors and what is considered proper or improper payments. So GlaxoSmithKline, I want to highlight actually that even though we've assessed them currently as category 5 for their bribery scandal in China, if you're looking forward, they actually have some very progressive strategies in place to avoid such practices in the future. So, for instance, by 2016, they want to stop all payments to doctors globally, anywhere in the world, for speaking about their products. And I haven't seen any peers with such far-reaching plans, actually. So that's just highlighting possible best practice for the future.
Okay, and that would, I suppose, relate to your positive outlook for business ethics at the end of that chapter in the report. But just to play a little bit of devil's advocate for the moment, I mean, still, when we look at the statistics, less than 50% of the companies, 132 companies that we rate, are following any drug promotion standards, adhering to drug promotion standards that might mean that they would be able to address bribery and corruption issues in any sort of stringent manner. And less than 50% of them are actually adhering to clinical trial standards at the moment as well. So whilst there's some maybe positive insights and trends that you've gained from some of the individual companies about their future with regard to business ethics, the current statistics are still pretty negative when it comes to adhering to certain standards.
Yeah, I think we need to also clearly distinguish between policies and practice in that sense. If you look at, well, to stick with the improper marketing issue or marketing practices for the moment, all the large global pharma companies adhere or either have their own marketing codes or adhere to marketing codes of industry associations or the WHO ethical marketing code. And so if you talk about the 50%, that includes all the large global pharma companies. It's probably more the smaller companies or emerging market companies that don't have those codes in place. But the code is really the starting point. It's having a policy in place is a starting point. It's a prerequisite for ethical behavior. It definitely doesn't ensure ethical behavior. The real challenge is, of course, in ensuring that these codes are implemented and adhered to in practice. So, for example, and then you're talking about, how do you train your sales staff? How do you incentivize your sales staff? Do you incentivize them in such a way that it could lead to improper behavior? How do you monitor sales practices, in practice in the field? Do you have a review committee that looks at promotional materials before they're sent out to ensure that they're in line with the promotional codes? All of these things, and those are the real challenges. It's not, it's easy to say we adhere to Code X, but how do you really do it in practice?
Okay, very good. Thanks, Hazel. We're getting a lot of different questions about R&D and innovation, and also with regard to our particular methodology and approach to rating the companies. Maybe if I just look at one of the R&D related questions at the moment, one question here states, how do you currently assess the extent to which a company invests in R&D for unmet health needs, especially when it goes beyond NTDs?
Yeah.
If you'd like to maybe explain what NTDs are for the rest of the participants.
So we're talking about neglected tropical diseases, which is a list of diseases put together by the WHO, and those are diseases where there's either no cure or not a sufficient treatment available. And the main reason for that is because it's actually not commercially viable for companies to focus on diseases that really only afflict poor people in tropical countries, to put it very bluntly, but that is just the case. We do have in our set of indicators for assessing pharma companies, we do have an indicator that looks at R&D for neglected diseases, so we give companies credit if they do R&D in those areas. And I think one of the ways that companies can address these challenges is, like I mentioned before, is through collaborations. So, and sometimes that is the only way for companies to address these R&D challenges, by spreading the risks and sharing in the rewards. And there's some great initiatives out there, such as the DNDi and WIPO research. So yeah, there is movement there, but we need more companies to enter into those collaborations.
Okay, very good. And maybe just tying that discussion into the broader industry trends. I mean, you highlight in the report how almost $60 billion more US dollars is spent on marketing than actual R&D when it comes to the large pharmaceutical companies. If there's a need for so much more R&D in terms of innovation, in terms of equitable pricing issues, in terms of value-based pricing, in terms of access to medicine innovation, Do you think, again, it's realistic for us to expect that there's going to be quick changes in terms of how much the pharmaceutical industry are going to be able to do when we have these clear facts in front of us that they're currently spending much more time on marketing than they are in R&D and innovation?
Yeah. Well, there's a number of things to be said about this. I mean, one is that I think it's inevitable that companies will have to, change their approach to marketing, and I think to some extent the industry realizes this. And I think we are actually seeing a reduction in marketing spending over the past few years in developed markets. The risk, of course, is that companies will then shift their marketing efforts to emerging markets, and the whole thing will repeat over again, until authorities there kind of catch up, which might not be too long, considering the recent developments in China. So I think it's inevitable. I don't know whether it's going to be a few years or longer, but that companies will have to change their approach to marketing. And indeed, switch their efforts to just developing good products that add a lot of socioeconomic added value, and that don't need to be marketed as aggressively.
Okay,
yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious of timing. We've about 5 minutes left. I would just like you to answer one question on our methodology before we move on. And I'd like to reassure our participants that if your question has not been answered today, we will take note of them. Hazel will respond to them individually and get responses back to you as soon as possible. We have also recorded this webinar, and we will send it out to participants following this presentation over the next few days. So just rest assured that your question will be addressed when Hazel has a chance to come to that. So just a final question on methodology, Hazel. There's been a lot of interest with regard to how we actually develop the indicators, how we choose them, how we apply them, and also how we engage with the companies in this rating process.
Mm-hmm.
Do we engage with them directly once we produce a score on their particular performance against particular issues? Could you explain that to the participants, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So we have a set of indicators, roughly 80 indicators, through which we assess ESG performance for pharma companies. I think about 50 of those indicators are what we call core indicators, so they apply for all industries. For instance, many of the corporate governance indicators are common to all the industries, or if you look at diversity or staff turnover. But then we have a set of indicators that are industry specific, and they're all related to the key ESG issues that we identified for the industry. So we have a few indicators that look at product quality and safety, a few indicators that look at access to medicine, etc. So this is how we assess company performance, and in the end it leads to a score between 0 and 100 and a ranking of pharmaceutical companies. But a big part of a very crucial part of our research process is that we always contact the companies after we've updated their company profile and give them the opportunity to provide feedback. So it might be that, that we've missed something, or that companies want to provide us with information that actually is not publicly available but that can influence our assessment. Our companies might want to provide feedback to our controversy assessments. We see an increasing response rate from companies. I think for pharma it's at, I think, roughly 50% of companies that now respond to our requests for feedback. It's a clear increase in the past few years, and I think part of it's also because investors are increasingly engaging with these companies. They talk to the companies and they mention that they use Sustainalytics data for their engagement, and then companies start realizing, oh, it actually pays off to respond to Sustainalytics requests. So we're more and more having these direct discussions with companies about their performance, and it also provides us with a lot of additional insight on best practice and how companies themselves view these issues and what they think the most salient ESG issues are.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Hazel, for leading a very interesting Q&A. If you haven't had time to send through a question, you can do so afterwards. Hazel's contact details are at the end of her presentation, and as I said, we will follow up with any questions we didn't get to today, and the recorded webinar will be sent out to all participants. I'd just like to thank you all for your presentation, or your presence here today, I should say, on the webinar, excuse me. It's been a very productive session. We would like to highlight to you that this pharmaceutical report is but one of a series of sector reports that Sustainalytics are currently producing. We aim to have at least 3 more sector reports produced in Q1 of this year, covering utilities, insurance and real estate, and we will also be engaging in webinars on those reports following the launch of those particular reports, which will be produced by the thematic research team in collaboration with the research products team here in Sustainalytics. We've come to almost 5 o'clock Central European time on the dot. So again, I'd like to thank you for your participation. We hope that it was interesting for you, and we look forward to further collaboration with you and your attendance at our following webinars.